My father smiled at every guest walking into the ballroom. Then he looked at me, pointed toward the catering area beside the kitchen, and said that was where I belonged. Not because there weren't enough seats. There were. Not because the room was full. It wasn't. Every uncle had a seat. Every cousin had a seat. Even a relative my parents hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years had a gold chair waiting for him. I was the only member of the family told to eat beside the catering staff. But there was something nobody inside that ballroom knew. The thin envelope tucked beneath my arm wasn't just an anniversary gift. It contained something my father had spent almost 20 years believing was gone forever. And less than 20 minutes after I sat down beside the waiters, one guest would walk through those doors, look directly at me, and completely freeze. That was the exact moment my parents' anniversary stopped being about celebrating 35 years of marriage. It became the night their biggest secret finally caught up with them. Welcome to Silent Grudge Stories, where family secrets finally come to light and those everyone underestimated finally have a voice. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever wondered what happens when the person everyone underestimated finally stops staying silent, make sure to subscribe. Because this story is only beginning. My name is Rowan Calloway. I'm 34 years old. And for most of my life, I believe being useful was the same thing as being loved. Looking back now, I don't know how I convinced myself those two things were ever connected. In my family, I was never the daughter people celebrated. I was the daughter people depended on. Whenever something complicated happened, my phone rang. Whenever paperwork disappeared, someone called me. Whenever my parents forgot birthdays, insurance renewals, travel reservations, tax deadlines, warranty claims, or anything else requiring responsibility, it somehow became my problem. Nobody officially assigned those jobs to me. They simply stopped doing them themselves. And after enough years, everyone forgot that I had a choice, including me. My mother used to tell people I was the organized one. Guests always smiled when they heard it. They assumed it was a compliment. It wasn't. It was a job description. The organized one never got surprised, never got spoiled, never got celebrated. She simply kept everything running while everyone else enjoyed the results. That's exactly what happened with their anniversary party. My mother wanted elegance. My father wanted admiration. My younger sister wanted to show up 15 minutes late looking important. I made all of that possible. I compared venues, negotiated contracts, reviewed invoices, confirmed every vendor, adjusted the seating chart 3 separate times because my mother kept changing her mind. I even spent an entire Saturday helping the florist redesign the entrance because my father suddenly decided white roses looked too plain. Nobody asked how many evenings I gave up. Nobody noticed the vacation days I used to meet suppliers during business hours. And honestly, I didn't expect them to. I had spent so many years being invisible that invisibility had started feeling normal. There was only one thing I kept entirely to myself: the gift. For almost 2 years, I had been working on something my father believed could never be recovered. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't money. It wasn't property. It was something far more personal. Something connected to a part of his life he rarely spoke about anymore. Finding it had required months of searching through forgotten records, old archives, private collections, and conversations with people who hadn't heard the Calloway name in decades. More than once, I almost gave up. But every time I imagined handing it to him, I kept going. I wanted, just once, to watch my father look at me with something other than expectation. Respect, pride, maybe even gratitude. That hope was folded inside the envelope resting under my arm as I drove to the venue that Saturday afternoon. It was probably the most hopeful I'd felt in years. Hope can be a dangerous thing, especially inside families that mistake loyalty for obligation. The venue looked exactly the way my mother had imagined it. Golden chairs, ivory linens, crystal centerpieces, live musicians tuning their instruments beneath a canopy of white lights. Everything looked perfect, mostly because I had made sure it would. I walked through the entrance carrying the envelope. Several vendors smiled when they saw me. They greeted me by name. Most of them assumed I was hosting the event. That happened surprisingly often. People naturally assume the person solving every problem must also be the person in charge. If only my family saw me that way. Out of habit, I checked every table before the guests arrived. The flowers were centered. The place settings matched my final layout. The photographer had already positioned himself near the entrance. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Everything except me. The seating chart stood beside the ballroom entrance. I smiled. I knew exactly where my name should be. After all, I was the one who created the chart. I looked at table 1. Nothing. Table 2. Nothing. Table 3. Nothing. I checked every single table. Slowly. Then again. My name wasn't there. At first, I assumed the venue had printed an older version by mistake. I reached for my phone to pull up the final seating file. Before I could unlock it, I heard footsteps behind me. Looking for something. My father's voice sounded unusually cheerful. I turned around. He was already dressed for the photographs. Tailored navy suit, silver tie, perfect smile. The kind of smile he only wore when other people were watching. "I think my place card is missing," I said. He barely glanced at the seating chart. Instead, he rested one hand lightly against my back. "Come with me." Without waiting for an answer, he guided me away from the ballroom. We passed the dessert station, walked beyond the kitchen entrance, continued past stacks of serving trays and beverage carts. Eventually, we reached a small break area where the catering staff ate between courses. A folding table, plastic chairs, coffee cups, aprons hanging from hooks on the wall. 4 waiters sat quietly finishing their meals before service began. One empty chair remained. My father pointed toward it. "You can sit here." For a second, I honestly thought he was joking. I waited for him to smile. He didn't. "The main tables are for the guests," he said casually. Then he added something I'll never forget. "Besides, you always end up helping the staff anyway." He turned around before I said a single word. I stood there, still holding the envelope against my chest. Through the open service doorway, I could already see relatives arriving. My sister was laughing with cousins. My mother was greeting neighbors. Champagne glasses clinked together. The musicians began playing the exact quartet I had hired 3 months earlier. One of the waiters quietly pulled the empty chair away from the table for me. His expression wasn't awkward. It was sympathetic. That stranger showed me more kindness in 3 silent seconds than my own family had shown me all afternoon. I sat down, placed the envelope on my lap, and tried convincing myself I could survive one more humiliation without letting anyone see it. Then the ballroom doors opened again. A distinguished older man entered beside his wife. He took only a few steps inside. His eyes drifted across the room, stopped on the catering table, and landed directly on me. He froze, not slowed down, not hesitated, froze. The color disappeared from his face. For several long seconds, he couldn't seem to move at all. The older man didn't move. Not immediately. His wife looked at him, confused, then followed his gaze toward the catering table. She looked at me, then back at him. Quietly, she asked, "Arthur?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step into the ballroom without taking his eyes off me. I had never seen him before. At least, I didn't think I had. His face looked vaguely familiar. The kind of familiar that comes from newspaper articles, business magazines, or television interviews. But I couldn't immediately place him. The conversations inside the ballroom gradually resumed. Most people hadn't even noticed he'd stopped walking. My parents certainly hadn't. They were too busy greeting more guests near the entrance. My sister, Tessa, laughed loudly as one of our cousins complimented her dress. Everything continued exactly as planned, except for one man. He was still staring at me. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of walking toward my parents, he changed direction, straight toward the catering area. One of the waiters beside me whispered, "I think he's coming here." I smiled awkwardly. There must be someone behind me. There wasn't. Every step he took made the room feel quieter. Not because people stopped talking, Because people started noticing where he was going. My father finally turned around. His welcoming smile disappeared for just a second. He quickly recovered and hurried across the ballroom. "Mr. Whitlock!" He extended both hands enthusiastically. "We're honored you could make it." Conrad Whitlock barely acknowledged him. He gave a polite nod without slowing down. His attention never left me. That alone was enough to confuse my father. Most people would have stopped. Conrad Whitlock was one of the most respected executives in the country. Someone my father had mentioned more than once over the years. Someone he had hoped would attend. Someone whose presence alone elevated the entire evening. Yet instead of greeting the hosts, he walked past them, straight toward the catering table. I slowly stood, not because I understood what was happening, because every instinct told me staying seated would somehow make the situation even stranger. When he finally stopped in front of me, he smiled, not the polite smile people wear at formal events. A genuine one, the kind that reaches someone's eyes. "Miss Calloway." For a second, my mind went completely blank. He knew my name. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Neither was I. Before I could answer, my father stepped beside him. "You two know each other?" Conrad looked genuinely surprised by the question. Then he looked back at me. "You never told them?" My stomach tightened. I had absolutely no idea what he meant. "I don't usually discuss my clients." His eyebrows lifted slightly. Then he laughed softly. "Of course. I should have known." My father frowned. "Clients." The word seemed to catch everyone's attention. My mother had quietly walked over. Tessa followed a few seconds later. Even several nearby guests began pretending not to listen while obviously listening. Conrad extended his hand toward me. "I've wanted to properly thank you for months." I shook it. Firmly. Professionally. Inside, I was desperately trying to remember exactly which project he'd been connected to. My work required confidentiality. Sometimes dozens of companies each year. Sometimes more. Faces blurred together. Names stayed inside contracts. Then it clicked. Whitlock Industries. 6 months earlier. A corporate crisis that had dominated financial headlines for nearly 2 weeks before suddenly disappearing. No explanation. No scandal. No lawsuits. Just silence. Exactly the outcome my clients hoped for. "You remember," Conrad said quietly after seeing the recognition on my face. I nodded. "Of course." He smiled again. "My board still talks about that week. We thought everything we'd built was finished." Several guests exchanged confused looks. My father forced a small laugh. "I'm afraid we're missing part of the story." Conrad looked at him. His expression remained polite. "Oh, I assumed you already knew." "Knew what?" my mother asked. He looked between all of us, then back at me, almost asking permission. I gave the slightest shake of my head. "Not yet." He understood immediately. Professional discretion. Even here. Even now. "I apologize," he said smoothly. "I've interrupted your celebration." My father relaxed slightly. "No interruption at all. It's wonderful seeing successful people know each other." Conrad smiled politely. "I wouldn't describe it that way." He turned toward me again. "I simply owe your daughter more than she'll ever admit." Silence. Complete silence. I could actually hear silverware clinking somewhere across the ballroom. My father chuckled awkwardly. "I'm sure Rowan helped in some small way." Conrad didn't smile this time. "Small." He repeated the word almost to himself. Then he looked directly at my father. "Mr. Calloway, if your daughter hadn't stepped into our offices when she did, my family would have lost our company." Nobody spoke. Not even Tessa. My father's expression froze somewhere between pride and confusion. He looked at me, then back at Conrad, as though trying to understand whether this was some elaborate misunderstanding. It wasn't. Conrad reached inside his jacket, pulled out a business card, turned it over, wrote something on the back, then handed it to me. "I've been trying to convince her to work exclusively with us." He smiled. "She keeps saying no." A few nearby guests laughed politely. My family didn't, because they weren't laughing anymore. They were staring at me, not with admiration, with disbelief. The kind that comes when someone you've underestimated your entire life suddenly no longer fits the version of them you've always believed. Then Conrad glanced at the cream-colored envelope still resting in my hands. "Is that for your father?" I nodded. "It is." His eyes lingered on it for a second. Then he looked back at me. "If it's anything like the last impossible thing you recovered." He smiled knowingly. He has absolutely no idea what's about to happen. And for the first time that evening, I realized the humiliation my father had planned for me was beginning to belong to someone else instead. I watched Conrad Whitlock disappear into the crowd. Within seconds, the conversation started again. The orchestra never stopped playing. Champagne continued flowing. People smiled, laughed, raised their glasses. From a distance, everything looked exactly like the elegant anniversary celebration my parents had spent months preparing. Only one thing had changed. Now dozens of people kept glancing toward the catering table. Toward me. My father noticed it immediately. For years, he'd been able to read a room better than almost anyone. He could tell when attention shifted, when curiosity spread, when whispers started before the first words were even spoken. And now, every few seconds someone looked past him. Not because of the anniversary. Because of me. His smile became noticeably tighter. He didn't come back to the catering area. Not yet. Instead, he started moving from guest to guest, laughing louder than before, shaking more hands than necessary, trying to pull the attention back where he believed it belonged. On himself. It didn't work. People had questions. Who was I? Why had Conrad Whitlock ignored the hosts to greet the woman sitting with the catering staff? Why had one of the country's most respected executives thanked her instead of the family celebrating the anniversary? Curiosity spreads faster than gossip, especially in rooms filled with successful people. I remained exactly where I was. The envelope still rested on my lap. For the first time since arriving, I considered leaving. It would have been easy. Nobody had actually invited me to stay. My seat wasn't inside the ballroom. No speech depended on me. No family photograph required me. I could quietly stand up, walk through the service corridor, get into my car, and disappear before dessert. Part of me wanted to. Another part reminded me why I had spent nearly 2 years searching for what was inside that envelope. I hadn't done it for recognition. I hadn't done it for revenge. I had done it because, despite everything, Victor Calloway was still my father. That truth frustrated me more than I liked admitting. The waiter sitting beside me quietly poured another cup of coffee. He didn't ask questions. He didn't stare. He simply pushed the cup slightly closer to me before returning to his meal. That small gesture somehow felt kinder than everything my own family had done all evening. Across the ballroom, I watched my sister moving effortlessly from table to table. Tessa had always been good at becoming the center of attention. She didn't even try. People naturally gravitated toward her. Growing up, my parents called it charisma. Whenever she forgot birthdays, someone else remembered. Whenever she missed deadlines, someone else fixed them. Whenever she made expensive mistakes, someone else paid for them. Most of the time, that someone was me. Looking back, I realized something uncomfortable. My family never actually expected Tessa to be responsible. They expected me to be responsible enough for both of us. It had always been easier that way. The dependable daughter quietly solved problems. The favorite daughter enjoyed the celebration. No one questioned the arrangement, least of all me. Until that night, I watched my mother approach Conrad Whitlock from across the ballroom. She smiled warmly, said something I couldn't hear. Conrad answered politely. Less than 10 seconds later, she walked away. Her smile had disappeared. That was unusual. My mother rarely lost control of social situations. She prided herself on making influential people feel welcome. Yet whatever conversation she'd expected, she clearly hadn't received it. A few minutes later, my father tried. The result looked exactly the same. Another polite conversation. Another disappointed expression. Another glance in my direction. I lowered my eyes toward the envelope. Its edges were beginning to soften from how tightly I'd been holding it. Inside was the only reason I was still there. Nothing else. Not the anniversary. Not the speeches. Certainly not the dinner. Only that envelope. A sudden burst of laughter echoed through the ballroom. The anniversary slideshow had started. Large photographs appeared across the projection screens. Wedding pictures, family vacations, Christmas mornings, birthdays, graduations, nearly 4 decades of memories. Guests smiled at every image. I watched quietly from the service area. Then I noticed something. Or rather, what wasn't there? Hundreds of photographs, dozens of family events, years of memories. I appeared in almost none of them. When I did, I wasn't standing beside my parents. I was always somewhere in the background, holding coats, carrying boxes, serving food, taking the photograph instead of being inside it. I wasn't erased. I was simply never considered part of the picture. That realization hurt far more than sitting with the catering staff. Because photographs never lie. They preserve exactly what people choose to remember. And my family had spent decades remembering everyone. Except me. The slideshow ended to loud applause. My father stepped onto the small stage near the dance floor. Microphone in hand. Perfect smile restored. He thanked everyone for coming. Thanked old friends, business partners, neighbors, even the event staff. Listening from the catering table, I couldn't help noticing something. He thanked almost every person who had helped organize the evening. The florist, the musicians, the chef, the decorators, the photographer. He never mentioned me. Not once. I wasn't surprised. Disappointment only exists when hope survives. Mine had been fading all evening. Then, just as my father prepared to invite everyone to dinner, I saw Conrad Whitlock quietly stand up again. This time, he wasn't walking toward the ballroom entrance. He was walking back toward me, and judging by the determined expression on his face, he hadn't finished saying what he'd come to say. Conrad Whitlock didn't return to me immediately. He stopped halfway across the ballroom, as though he had suddenly remembered something important. His eyes moved from my father to the stage, then to the cream-colored envelope resting against my side. For a brief moment, he seemed to reconsider whatever he had planned to do. Then he simply nodded to himself, almost as if he had decided this wasn't his story to tell. It was mine. I watched him quietly return to his table. My father, however, didn't stop watching me. He kept speaking into the microphone, thanking guests, sharing stories about 35 years of marriage, recalling vacations, old business deals, neighbors, family friends. His voice never changed, but every few seconds, his eyes drifted toward the catering section, toward me, toward the envelope. For the first time that evening, he looked uneasy, not embarrassed. Uneasy. There was a difference. Embarrassment comes from being judged. Uneasiness comes from realizing something no longer feels under your control. Until that moment, everything had unfolded exactly the way he'd expected. Seat me away from the family. Keep me invisible. Make sure everyone understood where I belonged. Conrad Whitlock had quietly destroyed that plan in less than 3 minutes. Without raising his voice. Without creating a scene. Without even trying. Sometimes, respect shown by the right person humiliates others more than any insult ever could. Dinner service finally began. The waiters around me stood up together. Within seconds, they disappeared through the service doors, carrying silver trays toward the ballroom. The small break room became almost silent. I was completely alone. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to breathe. No pretending. No smiling. No trying to convince myself none of it mattered. It did matter. More than I wanted to admit. I looked down at the envelope again. Its edges were beginning to bend from how tightly I had been holding it. Inside was nearly 2 years of work. Hundreds of phone calls. Archived records scattered across 4 states. Private collections. Estate sales. University libraries. Conversations with retired historians. Former business partners. People who hadn't heard the Calloway name in decades. More than once, someone had told me it no longer existed. More than once, someone suggested I stop looking. They were almost right. Twice, I had come within hours of abandoning the search completely. But every dead end eventually led to another clue. Every forgotten document pointed somewhere else. Every missing piece somehow connected to another. Eventually, the impossible slowly became possible. The strange part wasn't finding it. The strange part was realizing why nobody else ever had. They had searched for the wrong thing. I searched for the right story. That was always my job. People hired me because they believed I solved corporate crises. The truth was slightly different. I found missing pieces, facts other people overlooked, connections nobody else considered important. Whether I was helping multinational companies protect their reputations or searching through forgotten family history, the process never really changed. Follow the evidence. Ignore assumptions. Never stop at the obvious answer. Those same instincts had led me to what rested inside that envelope, something my father had mourned for almost 20 years, something everyone believed had disappeared forever. I gently ran my thumb across the seal. Just once. A tiny movement, almost enough to open it. Almost. Instead, I placed it back on my lap. If my father was going to receive it, he would receive it exactly as I'd planned. No matter how the evening ended, a burst of applause echoed from inside the ballroom. The first course had been served. Guests laughed louder now. Wine glasses filled more quickly. The atmosphere gradually relaxed again. From where I sat, I could only see fragments through the open service doors, a glimpse of crystal chandeliers, the edge of the dance floor, the projection screens. Occasionally, my father's silhouette, still moving from table to table, still trying to become the center of every conversation. Then I noticed something unexpected. People kept interrupting him. Not to congratulate him, to ask questions. I couldn't hear the conversations. I didn't need to. Each guest looked toward me at least once before my father answered. Some nodded, some frowned, some glanced back toward Conrad Whitlock. The pattern repeated over and over again. Curiosity had replaced celebration. Whatever image my father wanted people to remember that night, it was slipping away from him. Slowly, quietly, irreversibly. Several minutes later, my mother entered the service corridor. She didn't know I could see her before she reached the doorway. Her expression was completely different from earlier. No warm smile, no confident posture. She looked irritated, not because of me, because she had lost control of the evening. She stopped just outside the break room, looked around to make sure nobody else was nearby, then finally looked at me, not with concern, not with guilt, with calculation. Her eyes immediately dropped to the envelope. She hadn't noticed it before. Now she couldn't stop looking at it. For a second, I wondered if she somehow knew what was inside. Impossible. No one knew. Not even Conrad. He knew I had recovered something impossible for another client. He had no idea I had spent 2 years doing the same thing for my own father. My mother slowly walked closer. Not close enough to sit beside me, just close enough to lower her voice. She didn't ask if I was all right. She didn't apologize for where I'd been seated. She didn't mention Conrad Whitlock. Instead, her entire attention remained fixed on the envelope. At that exact moment, I realized something. Neither of my parents had asked me a single question since I arrived. Not about work, not about my life, not about how I had been. The first thing that had finally captured their attention was the one thing I hadn't shown them, and somehow that felt even more revealing than the empty seat they'd given me. She took another slow step forward. Her eyes never left the envelope. Then she quietly asked the first question either of my parents had directed at me all evening. "What exactly did you bring?" I looked at the envelope, then back at my mother. For a brief second, I considered telling her, not because she had earned the answer, because part of me still imagined everything could end differently. That illusion disappeared the moment I looked into her eyes. She wasn't curious about me. She was curious about the envelope. There was a difference, a painful one. For years, my parents had mastered the art of asking questions that sounded personal but were really transactional. They never asked how I was feeling. They asked whether something had been finished. They never asked whether I was happy. They asked whether I was available. Tonight was no different. The envelope had become interesting. I hadn't. I simply smiled. It's Dad's anniversary gift. Nothing more. Nothing less. She waited, probably expecting an explanation. When none came, her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She glanced toward the ballroom before speaking again. I hope it isn't something that makes tonight awkward. There it was. Not concern. Control. She wasn't worried about hurting me. She was worried about protecting the image of the evening. That had always been her priority. Everything needed to look perfect, even when nothing actually was. I nodded politely. It won't. That answer seemed to satisfy her. Or perhaps she simply believed whatever was inside couldn't possibly matter very much. After all, when someone spends years convincing themselves one child is ordinary, they stop expecting extraordinary things from them. She quietly returned to the ballroom, without apologizing, without asking me to join everyone else, without even noticing the untouched dinner sitting in front of me. The silence returned. I watched through the partially open service doors as speeches continued. Friends stood one after another. Old business partners shared stories. Neighbors talked about loyalty. Family members described my parents as generous, devoted, selfless. Each compliment was followed by applause. Each story painted another perfect picture. Listening from outside, I almost wondered whether they were talking about different people. Then I reminded myself of something I'd learned years earlier. Reputation isn't built from who people are. It's built from what others are allowed to see. That was exactly why companies hired me. Public image and private reality rarely looked the same. Families weren't much different. Sometimes they were worse. I noticed Conrad Whitlock again. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching the stage. He kept quietly observing my parents. Occasionally, his attention shifted toward me, not with pity, almost with curiosity, as though he were trying to understand why someone who had solved problems worth hundreds of millions of dollars had willingly accepted being treated like an afterthought by her own family. The truth was, I wasn't entirely sure anymore. A year earlier, I probably would have laughed the whole situation off. 6 months earlier, I would have convinced myself my parents hadn't meant anything by it. 3 months earlier, I would have blamed myself for being too sensitive. Tonight, none of those excuses felt convincing anymore. Distance changes perspective. Working with executives, founders, international firms, I'd spent years around people who expected excellence. Many of them were demanding. Some were impossible. But almost all of them understood something my family never had. Competence deserves respect, not exploitation. The realization had been growing quietly inside me for years. Tonight, it finally became impossible to ignore. The applause inside the ballroom suddenly grew louder. Another slideshow had begun. This one wasn't family photographs. It showed messages that guests had recorded before the anniversary. Short congratulations, funny memories, old friends sharing stories. I recognized several faces, people my parents had known for decades. Then, a familiar voice filled the room. It belonged to my grandfather. He had passed away almost 12 years earlier. The room immediately became quiet, even from the service corridor. I could feel the atmosphere change. Someone had found an old recording. Guests smiled warmly. My father looked genuinely emotional. My mother wiped away a tear. I watched the screen through the narrow gap in the doorway. My grandfather looked much younger, healthier. He spoke slowly, carefully. He congratulated my parents, talked about family, about time, about gratitude. Then he said something that caught my attention. He smiled directly into the camera. If you're watching this, I hope you've learned that the people holding everything together rarely ask for recognition. The ballroom became completely silent. My heartbeat slowed. I had never heard that recording before. Neither had my parents. I could tell from the expressions on their faces. Grandfather continued, "The strongest person in a family usually isn't the loudest. They're the one quietly carrying everyone else." Several guests nodded. Some even laughed softly. They assumed it was simply wise advice. Only I noticed my father's expression changing. Because he knew exactly who my grandfather had been talking about. He always had. He had simply chosen not to listen. The recording ended. Applause filled the room once again. But this applause felt different. Quieter. Reflective. People weren't celebrating. They were thinking. Several guests instinctively turned toward different family members. A few turned toward me, not because they knew the whole story, because the pieces were beginning to fit together. The daughter sitting with the catering staff. The executive who crossed the ballroom to thank her. The grandfather speaking about the person no one appreciated. None of it felt like coincidence anymore. My father noticed those looks. His smile returned almost immediately. Too quickly. He thanked everyone, made another joke, announced it was finally time for the anniversary gifts. One by one, guests began bringing beautifully wrapped boxes toward the front of the ballroom. Expensive wine, artwork, travel vouchers, luxury watches, decorative pieces, the kind of gifts people admired for a few seconds before moving on. I stayed exactly where I was. The cream-colored envelope rested quietly against my leg. It looked almost insignificant compared to everything else. No ribbon, no elaborate wrapping, no expensive packaging, just thick paper, a wax seal, and nearly 2 decades of unanswered questions waiting inside. Then, my father looked across the ballroom. His eyes found me almost instantly. For the first time that evening, he didn't look annoyed. He looked interested. He raised one hand, gesturing for me to come forward, not because he suddenly wanted me beside the family, because he had finally noticed. I was carrying a gift too. Every conversation inside the ballroom gradually faded into the background. I only saw one thing, my father's hand, still gesturing for me to come forward. If someone had walked into the room at that exact moment, they would have assumed he'd been waiting for me all evening, as though nothing unusual had happened, as though I hadn't spent the last hour eating beside the catering staff, as though my chair inside the ballroom had never disappeared. It was remarkable how quickly people rewrote reality once they realized someone important was paying attention. A dozen guests turned toward me, then another dozen. The room slowly opened a path between the tables, waiting, watching, expecting. I remained exactly where I was, not to embarrass my father, because something finally became clear. For years, whenever my family wanted something from me, I moved immediately. I answered immediately. I solved it immediately. Tonight, for the first time, I didn't. Only 3 or 4 seconds passed. It felt much longer. My father lowered his hand. They usually felt incredibly quiet. I stopped a few feet away from the stage, not beside my parents. In front of them, there was a difference. My father reached for the envelope almost automatically. I didn't hand it over. Not yet. His hand remained suspended in the air for an awkward second before he slowly pulled it back. Almost nobody noticed. I did. So did Conrad Whitlock. He leaned back in his chair, watching carefully. The rest of the guests simply smiled, assuming this was another planned part of the celebration. My father laughed softly into the microphone. Looks like Rowan brought something too. A few polite laughs followed. He stretched out his hand again, this time waiting. Again. I didn't move, not out of spite, because for the first time in my life, I wanted him to actually look at me before taking something from me. He finally did. Really looked. Not through me. At me. It had probably been years since that happened. Maybe longer. I smiled. A calm smile. I'd like to say something first. The request itself changed the room. Not because it was unreasonable. Because nobody expected it from me. I wasn't the daughter who gave speeches. I organized them. I wasn't the one standing in front. I was the one making sure everyone else looked good. My father hesitated, only briefly, then handed me the microphone. Confident, relaxed, probably assuming I was about to thank them. Talk about family. Tell everyone how grateful I was. He had no reason to expect anything else. After all, that was the role I'd played my entire life. I looked across the ballroom. Faces I'd known since childhood. Neighbors, old teachers, business partners, relatives. Some smiled warmly. Others looked confused. Several were still quietly watching Conrad Whitlock instead of me. I took one slow breath. I've been working on this anniversary gift for almost 2 years. The room became still. I started because my father once told me that losing it was the greatest regret of his life. I saw something change in my father's expression. Recognition. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Almost immediately, he looked at the envelope differently. Not as another gift, as a possibility. I was told dozens of times that it couldn't be found. I almost believed them. I almost stopped looking. Nobody moved. No glasses clinked. No chair scraped across the floor. Even the hotel staff had stopped walking. I kept searching anyway. I thought. I paused. Not for effect. Because the next sentence suddenly felt heavier than I'd expected. I thought this would finally be the moment my father saw me the way I had always hoped he would. Silence. Complete silence. I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't exposing family secrets. I was simply telling the truth. Sometimes, the truth creates more discomfort than anger ever could. My father shifted his weight. His smile had disappeared. Not because I'd embarrassed him. Because he had no prepared response. There wasn't one. How do you argue with someone's hope? You can't. I looked down at the envelope again. For just a second. Then back toward him. I brought this here because I wanted tonight to become one of your happiest memories. Another pause. Small. Almost invisible. But something happened before dinner. Nobody blinked. You reminded me that gifts don't change the way people value you. Every eye in the ballroom slowly turned toward my father. Not because I had mentioned the catering table. I hadn't. They were connecting the pieces themselves. Conrad Whitlock. The service area. The grandfather's recording. My speech. None of it needed explaining anymore. People are often far better at reaching uncomfortable conclusions than we expect. I gently placed the envelope on the table beside the anniversary cake. Still unopened. Still sealed. Still untouched. My father instinctively reached toward it again. Then stopped himself, almost afraid. For the first time all evening, he wasn't thinking about opening it. He was wondering what it had already cost him. And at that exact moment, a voice from the back of the ballroom quietly broke the silence. I think it was Conrad Whitlock. Before Mitchell opens that envelope, everyone deserves to know what Rowan had to sacrifice just to find what was inside. Conrad Whitlock didn't move. He simply remained where he was. Calm, confident, like a man who had no interest in humiliating anyone, only in telling the truth. The ballroom grew impossibly quiet. Every guest turned toward him. My father slowly withdrew his hand from the envelope. He tried to smile. It didn't quite work. Conrad looked at the guests before speaking again. I've worked with hundreds of consultants over the last 30 years. Some are brilliant. Some are unforgettable. Rowan belongs to the second group. Nobody interrupted him. Because this no longer sounded like a compliment. It sounded like the beginning of something much bigger. I knew she had been working on something personal. I just didn't realize what. He glanced at me. One evening I asked why she kept disappearing every weekend. I assumed she had accepted another client. A faint smile crossed his face. I couldn't have been more wrong. He looked back toward my father. She was spending every free weekend searching for something that belonged to you. A murmur rippled across the ballroom. Small, but impossible to ignore. Conrad continued. She visited collectors, private archives, estate sales, retired historians. She followed dead ends for months. She spent her own money, her own time, and every Monday morning, she returned to the office without mentioning any of it. I lowered my eyes. Those weekends came rushing back. Airports before sunrise. Long drives that ended with another disappointment. Boxes filled with records that led nowhere. Calls that lasted hours. Entire months without a single clue. More than once, I had almost given up. But every time I pictured my father opening that envelope, I kept going. Conrad's voice interrupted my thoughts. I asked her once why she refused to stop. His eyes met mine for only a second. I'll never forget what she told me. The ballroom remained perfectly still. Because if I can give my father back the one thing he thought was gone forever, maybe this time he'll finally feel proud that I'm his daughter. No applause followed. No one moved. Because those words didn't sound heroic. They sounded heartbreaking. My father's expression changed. For the first time all evening, he wasn't looking at the envelope. He was looking at me. Really looking. As if he had just met the daughter standing in front of him. Conrad slowly exhaled. When I arrived tonight, I expected to celebrate an anniversary. Instead, I watched the woman who spent 2 years trying to make her father's dream come true. Eat dinner with the catering staff. No anger. No accusation. Just one simple sentence. It landed harder than any speech could have. Around the ballroom, people slowly began putting the pieces together. The seating arrangement, the grandfather's recording, my speech, the envelope. None of it looked accidental anymore. My father cleared his throat. Conrad, I think there's been some. Conrad gently shook his head. I've spent my career studying character, Mitchell. And one thing never changes. The people who quietly carry the greatest burdens are usually the ones everyone assumes will keep carrying them forever. Silence. Complete silence. My father had no answer. Neither did my mother. For the first time that evening, the room wasn't waiting for them to speak. It was waiting for me. I looked at the envelope resting beside the anniversary cake. 2 years. Hundreds of hours. Thousands of miles. All for this single moment. I had imagined it so many times. My father smiling, opening the envelope, looking at me with pride. Instead, he looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Regret. I stepped toward the table, picked up the envelope, and held it between both hands. My father instinctively reached forward, then stopped himself. He no longer assumed it belonged to him. I looked directly into his eyes. I didn't spend 2 years searching for this, because I wanted people to admire me. My voice remained calm. I did it because I thought one gift could finally fix something that had been broken between us for years. I paused. The ballroom didn't make a sound. But before I decide whether I should give it to you, I looked at my father without blinking. I need you to answer one question. Another silence settled over the room. Not tense. Heavy. If Conrad Whitlock had never walked across this ballroom tonight, would you have ever left me sitting with the catering staff? My question hung in the air. No one looked away. My father opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. It was the first time all evening he genuinely didn't know what to say. Not because he lacked words, because every possible answer trapped him. If he said yes, he admitted everything. If he said no, everyone in the ballroom knew he was lying. The silence became his answer. I nodded almost imperceptibly. I understand. I didn't sound angry. That made it worse. For years, I had imagined confronting my parents. I thought it would happen with shouting, accusations, tears. Instead, it ended with one unanswered question. And somehow, that hurt far more. My mother suddenly stepped forward. Rowan, sweetheart. The word felt strangely unfamiliar. She hadn't called me that in years. Tonight isn't the time for this. I looked at her. When was the right time? She froze. When I was 16. When you missed my graduation because Tessa had a tennis tournament. When you forgot my promotion dinner. When you asked me to organize this entire anniversary, but couldn't find a seat for me. Each sentence landed softly. No anger. No raised voice. Just memories. None of them could be denied. Around the ballroom, people slowly lowered their eyes. Some guests had known my family for decades, yet I could tell from their expressions. Many were replaying years of small moments they had never questioned. The forgotten daughter, the reliable daughter, the invisible daughter. Those patterns suddenly looked very different. My father finally took one slow step toward me. Rowan, I failed you. For simple words. Words I had wanted to hear for years. But something unexpected happened. They didn't heal anything. Because apologies offered only after public exposure always carry one painful question. Would they have happened if nobody else had been watching? I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty changed everything. I lowered my eyes to the envelope. This is yours. A wave of relief crossed my father's face. For just a second. Then I continued. It has always been yours. I never searched for it because I expected anything in return. I searched because I loved you. The ballroom remained silent. But love should never have to compete for a place at the table. No one breathed. I slowly extended the envelope. This time, my father accepted it carefully, almost reverently. His hands were trembling. He looked at the old wax seal, ran his thumb across it, then carefully opened it. Inside, there was no money, no contract, no deed, only a leather portfolio, a faded black and white photograph, and one folded document. The moment my father saw the photograph, his knees almost gave out. Oh! It escaped him before he could stop it. He reached for the nearest chair. My mother leaned closer. What is it? He couldn't answer. He simply stared. Tears filled his eyes. The photograph showed a much younger version of my grandfather, standing beside the first workshop the family had ever owned. The building that had been destroyed decades earlier. The one my father always believed had disappeared without leaving a trace. Behind the photograph was the original handwritten journal my grandfather had kept while building the business. Every sketch, every note, every lesson, every dream. The journal my father had spent more than 20 years trying to find. The journal every collector believed had been lost forever. My father carefully opened the first page. His father's handwriting stared back at him, exactly as he remembered it. He covered his mouth. A tear finally escaped. I stopped believing this still existed. His voice barely came out. I searched everywhere. I smiled faintly. I know. You told me. And I never forgot. He looked at me again. Not through me. Not past me. At me. With a mixture of gratitude and unbearable regret. Because he finally understood something. The greatest thing he had lost that evening was never inside the envelope. It was standing in front of him all along. He had almost spent an entire lifetime overlooking the one person who had loved him enough to bring his past back to him. The ballroom remained completely silent. No applause, no speeches, because everyone understood. Some moments don't need witnesses. They need reflection. A few minutes later, as guests quietly began leaving the ballroom, Conrad Whitlock walked beside me toward the exit. He glanced back once. Mitchell was still sitting at the table, reading his father's journal. My mother sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. Conrad smiled faintly. You gave him exactly what he wanted. I looked through the ballroom doors one last time. No, I answered quietly. I gave him one last chance to become the father I always hoped he could be. Whether he would use it was no longer my responsibility. For the first time in my life, I walked away from my family without feeling like I had left something behind. Because I finally realized the thing I had spent years searching for was never hidden inside an old envelope. It was my own peace, and I had finally found it.